Well, Chuck DeGroat, I'm really grateful that you're able to give us just a few minutes of your time, and grateful for your writing. I've been edified by your books. Some of our leaders have been edified by your books. One of them being Wholeheartedness, which some people will be familiar with. Got an important, it is a one way to describe the book, but it's an important book on narcissism. It wasn't a fun read, but it was a really important, timely read that finding narcissism in the church is a hard topic, but I'm really grateful for that book. But wholeheartedness has been an important theme for our church because we oftentimes find ourselves divided. And we're in this season of pandemic where our lives, we can't be as performative as we have been in the past, and it's more hidden. So we're trying to pursue intimacy with Jesus, a kind of spiritual wholeness in our life with Christ. And so I would just love to hear from you. You write on wholeheartedness, and I've heard some of your story in other talks or interviews that you've given, but I'd just love to hear your story. How did you go from just knowing about God that's mixed with motivation and ambitions to now maybe a little bit closer to intimacy with Christ? And yeah, what's your story in that?
Yeah, and I'm glad you said a little bit more, because I mean, I think it's aspirational, right? It's just as much for me and a hopeful book even for my own journey, which began, just to get to your question, really began for me in earnest back in my mid-20s. I was a student down at Reformed Theological Seminary, and I always say that I was one of those kind of terribly reformed, totally reformed, whatever TR stands for, I was that, arrogant and reformed. And it was a counseling professor, actually, who I didn't have a whole lot of respect for, because I thought he was the touchy-feely, all in your emotions kind of professor, and I had sort of dismissed him. It was this professor who, in a really courageous moment, called me out. It was kind of a providential moment. I had come to him because I was exhausted at 27. Like, who's exhausted at 27? But I had been studying overseas and wanting to go on and do a PhD, and he just started naming things, and it began a journey for me. It began with therapy. I did a master's degree in mental health counseling at the seminary at the same time. But it really exposed my own divided life, and this language that people may be familiar with, this shadow side of my life that I hadn't talked about, and I wouldn't dare talk about. I mean, I wanted to get ordained. I wanted to be a minister. Who would talk about the dark parts, the shadow parts. So I'm really grateful. I turned 50 this year. That it began at 27, and it feels like, I mean, I really like Thomas Merton's language of returning to the beginning of our journeys, recognizing that we're all beginners on the journey. And I still very much feel like a beginner on the journey.
Who have been some of the, you mentioned Thomas Merton, who have been just some of the voices that have helped shaped, what we have found is discovering language, so that beginner's journey that sometimes just creates meaning for the next steps for us. But who has sort of filled in the gaps for you along the way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think because I was sort of steeped in a tradition, it was really important for me to see the importance of going on this journey, not only as a psychological or therapeutic kind of journey, but as a theological one too. I remember early on, St. Augustine, it was a really big deal for me to sort of arrive at chapter 10 of Augustine's Confessions and hear him say, "Let me know myself, let me know you, O Lord." And after sort of going through the details of his story, talk about the importance of exploring the vast caverns of our memory. And that was really important for someone who had some suspicion of therapy and psychology to understand that this is a sort of a theologically sanctioned journey by Augustine. I now define wholeheartedness as the experience of oneness and worthiness in Christ. And that sense of oneness really is inspired by Augustine's idea that God is more near to me than I am to myself. You know, we go looking for God and here and there and everywhere, right? And that God is already present. God is already near. I think a second piece, Henry Nouwen was big. If wholeheartedness is the experience of oneness and worthiness in Christ, Nouwen was big for the worthiness piece, because he talks about trying to find our worthiness and attainment, accomplishment, reputation, degrees, and titles. And here I was, a 20-something, looking to go off and do a PhD, be ordained, and have the MDiv and the PhD and all this stuff that I think within a few years became really, really insignificant as I discovered the poverty of it all, really. I mean, I think that's when you discovered the extent of the division in your life, you really realize the poverty of these things that we place our affections in, or put our trust in, or trust our reputations to. And so that was a really big deal too. So now in Augustine, Merton, Gerald May, who's since passed, but wrote a book called Addiction and Grace, a spiritual director. I could go on with, I can give you authors all day though. So
yeah.
Yeah.
What was interesting, I was, you know, we're Protestant, and we have the tradition of union with Christ, and we're justified, and adoption, and all these terms. And I remember reading, I was trying to multitask. I was reading something, and I was actually watching on YouTube an old recorded sermon by Henry Nouwen on Jesus's baptism.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's called the cry of the beloved, or something like that. And it just in this, and man, Nouwen's a great preacher, but he was just fervently trying to get whoever was listening to him, the crowd who he was talking to understand that in Christ, we can hear that cry of the Father from the heaven that you are my beloved Son, I'm pleased with you. And I just remember I know that truth. I've heard that truth, and just for some reason in that moment, I was in a cubicle in the library of a seminary, and it just like hit me like a ton of bricks. Suddenly, like all of the landmines that had been planted along the way just exploded all at once. And for some reason, it took at that time, an obscure Catholic to bring home a very Protestant truth that I'd always known and studied and heard. And so it's just so interesting to me that those kind of stories happen. It kind of hits you sideways. Well, what are some just practical, or just maybe for you personally, just some practices or regular rhythms that have helped sustain a kind of intimacy with Christ, and that helps you walk towards wholeheartedness in your own life?
Yeah. When I explore practices with folks, I'll often talk about practices of seeking and practices of dwelling, because there are really two traditions of Christian spirituality, tradition of seeking and a tradition of dwelling. When we talk about seeking, we look at our stories more as pilgrimage. We look at our stories through the lens of the Exodus story. My first book was a book on the Exodus story, how we go on this journey through the wilderness of our lives. And so there are practices that invite us to go on a journey with Jesus, to seek after Jesus. I think in a sense, when we use daily prayer practices, the Book of Common Prayer, daily office, there's a kind of pursuit of God through prayer. For people who are familiar with something like the labyrinth, there's a pursuit of God through a particular maze-like walking path where we recognize and reveal idols and lay them down and move toward union and communion with God. I think that over the years, I've been more and more impacted by the spirituality of dwelling, which is really this recognition that God is already present. as Augustine says. And we, as I often tell my classes, I mean, we are about removing every obstacle to union with God. And life kind of looks sometimes like recognizing another obstacle and another obstacle and another obstacle to the God who's already in union with us. Oh, that's taking me in this direction, and this is blinding me in that way, and this is calling for my affection in this way. And so contemplative prayer has been a really big part of that for me. Silence, solitude. That may be, there's not one way of doing this. So when we talk about contemplative prayer, everyone wants to look for like the thing. That may look like a walk through nature where you simply get quiet and discover the God who's already there. You know, you get away from distraction and suddenly you're walking out in a beautiful forest or through Central Park and you discover the God who is already there. It may mean 10, 15, 20 minutes of simply turning off the TV and turning off CNN and Fox News, MSNBC, whatever your cable network of choice is. Put down the book, even put down the Bible, and just be aware of the God who's already speaking, already pursuing you. And so I think practices, John, that recognize that God is already pursuing me. And I've often said, I think as I've transitioned into like the second half of life, that the first half of life was very much a spirituality of seeking after God. And it's very much become now this sense that God has been pursuing me from the very beginning. I just need to recognize that and realize that I'm the one putting the obstacles in the way.
Yeah. Yeah, we often say things like prayer and spiritual life is really just trying to put ourselves in the way of God's love and renewing power. It's not trying to climb a mountain. It's not trying to put ourselves on a rocket ship to ascend to heavens. He's already come down and he's present with us. And so, yeah, just becoming more of awake to where God is already present in our lives. So if you had you talk about second half of your life, there is, 28, 29-year-olds, 30-year-olds in our church who are maybe in the performing arts or finance. And if they're not kind of already made it at age 28 to 30, then there's this kind of, whether it's a myth or not, that it's it. Like you're already past. And so there's a kind of that, almost that Ronald Rolheiser disappointment. Like I'm longing for a second honeymoon place. And there's that feeling at age 29 to 30 that life has left me behind and there's nothing ahead of me now. There's not too many more rungs on the ladder. And if you've gone from like seeking to dwelling, how would you just encourage that 29-year-old that feels like, man, I don't know what's ahead of me now. I've kind of given my life to pursue these things and I don't know what else is ahead.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so I pastored in San Francisco and I was in my mid to late 30s, early 40s during that season. And it felt like this was a very alive conversation. Particularly for those who sort of moved to the city to pursue the dream and hit obstacles along the way and discovered maybe in their early 30s a deeper loneliness emerging or a hope for something that went unattained. A couple of things that I really believed in the importance of long-term discipleship. And actually sort of created a program called the New Begin Fellows Program back then, using the kind of work of the missionary theologian Leslie Newbegin to walk with them for 9 months through a more rigorous discipleship program that looked at their inner life and looked at their life and mission essentially too. What I mean by that, I think what the invitation is to sort of find some way to engage in a discipleship relationship or a group of women and men who are in a kind of similar place. This is what the real magic of that program was I'm walking through this with women and men who are wrestling with the same loneliness. I think there's a loneliness in the city, right, that people experience that you might not experience in the same way elsewhere. And to name the kinds of things, and this was behind wholeheartedness in part, to name the kinds of aches of the human heart that you experience in a unique way, often as a single person in the city. That was at least a piece of it. There was another thing that was really important, and that was retreat, intentional retreat. And so I would take them away. I'd create offerings for 24 to 48 hours of retreat and simply invite them to get away, put their devices down. And that proved to be really important for really busy sort of climbers, achievers in the city. That proved to be an important 48 hours where they could get away, and they could afford that in their schedule, right? They do it. And I do some spiritual direction during that time. They'd hate me like in the first 18 hours of silence. They'd be like, I can't do this. This is terrible. But after about 36 hours, certainly toward the end, there was a sense of this is a gift. I am not quiet enough. I'm not silent enough. And you've probably experienced this, to eat together in silence, to dwell together in silence, to sit together, to pray together in silence, was a really significant part of that. But once again, just kind of opening up opportunities to sort of name the reality of what's going on in the human heart, because I think oftentimes we're so busy that we sort of neglect that inner conversation.
Yeah, whenever we sort of walk people through practices of solitude, it also tends to bring up more counseling issues, because all the anxiety comes to the surface, and and so there's always kind of crisis moments after that, but that it needed to come up and it needed to be dealt with. And so what's some good, just like, okay, I buy into your practices, I buy into just I want to press into that wholeheartedness and life in Christ. Yeah. How would you encourage someone to get started? Maybe especially someone who's had some like starts and stops, and feeling maybe a little discouraged or frustrated with themselves over the starts and stops. Yeah.
I've become less idealistic and more pragmatic over the years. And early on, it was like, there's one way of doing this, and you've got to do it my way. And I think nowadays, I really try to tune in, especially in my spiritual direction work, to what you uniquely need. And I want people to walk away with this with a sense of, it may be that the thing that John does, the thing that Chuck does, doesn't really work for me. So whether it's centering prayer, silence, solitude, a walk through nature, whatever it might be, there's some recent writing that I've really enjoyed. Martin Laird has written a trilogy of books. The first one is called Into the Silent Land. He's out at Villanova. He's an Augustinian monk and professor at Villanova. Really beautiful books, deeply theological. And I think it's Laird who says, prayer to some degree is anything that disposes you to union and communion with God. It's a matter of intention. It's a matter of disposition. And so awareness and intentionality are really important aspects of any prayer practice, whether you're taking a walk through the park, whether you are using art. Henry Nouwen's book, Return of the Prodigal Son, uses Rembrandt's great painting to facilitate prayer practice. Whether this is 10 or 15 or 20 minutes of silence, what I've realized over the years is I can do a daily prayer practice and not even show up to it. Or I can take a walk around Central Wesleyan Church, which is in my backyard here, around the property there, and simply be more in tune and aware on that walk than I was with a Bible in hand or with a prayer book in hand. And so go on a walk and say, where are you, God? Dispose yourself, to use the language of Martin Laird. Dispose yourself by way of intention, by way of awareness, to a certain kind of presence, to a disposition that sort of acknowledges that God is already there. God is already smiling upon you. That's the goodness, the grace of God. God's already smiling, saying, I see you, John. I love you. So just wake up and be present to me, and let's talk, or let's not talk. I don't care. I just like being with you.
Yeah. It's helpful just to kind of imagine prayer practices like a coat you try on. You try someone's method. Okay, that works, but let me tailor it here and have it fit a little bit. And intimacy, I think, is helpful in imagination. It's a deeply relational connectivity with Christ, and sometimes that it's just deeply impractical. There's no purpose or end to it other than just being with the person that you love.
Which is always intentional, right? In a friendship.
It's always intentional.
Always. It just doesn't happen by sitting in front of the TV watching your favorite news program.
No, it doesn't. Well, Chuck, I'm really grateful. You were really generous with your time and your thoughts and explorations, and I'm really grateful. We're going to be blessed with this. I'm excited for our church to hear this, and blessings in this season. I pray. I don't know what it's like in Michigan, but we're just in stage 1 here in New York in this recording. So
I grew up on Long Island. My sister's been an essential worker, and she's in it right now. But she's like, you don't want to come to New York this summer, Chuck. You don't want to come back. So I'm not coming back. I hope to visit you in person at some point, though, John. It's good getting to know you.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Take care.